Peru saw its third and final presidential debate organized by the National Jury of Elections this Wednesday as the country prepares for general elections. Mali launched its first immunization campaign against the COVID-19 with the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine in the city of Bamako. Zimbabwean President Emerson Mnangagwa received President Botswana Mokgweetsi Masisi this Wednesday, who visited Zimbabwe in his capacity as chairperson of the Southern Africa Development Community Organ on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Gladys Quesada. Now we begin with the news. In Peru, saw its third and final presidential debate organized by the National Jury of Elections this Wednesday as the country prepares for the April 11th general elections. Each of the debates held over the past 3 days featured 6 of the 18 presidential candidates as a measure imposed to reduce the risk of COVID-19 infection. The debates were made up of 5 thematic blocks focusing on proposed measures to face the COVID-19 pandemic: education, security, public integrity, and the fight against corruption. Peru has been locked into a long-standing political crisis which saw the impeachment of President Martín Vizcarra last year and widespread protests against the corruption of the political elite and calling for a new constitution. The Peruvian Congress has approved a report to sanction former President Martín Vizcarra for secretly vaccinating himself against COVID-19. The Congressional Subcommittee on Constitutional Accusations is seeking to sanction Vizcarra for secretly immunizing himself with doses destined for the clinical trials of the Sinopharm vaccine against the COVID-19 in the country. The report includes the accumulated constitutional complaints number 423 and also 427, which propose the former president's disqualification from holding public office for 10 years. The report will now pass to the standing committee, before which Vizcarra will have to present his defense. The Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, thanked the Guatemalan president for monitoring the border with Honduras during a telephone call on Tuesday to discuss the recent surge of Central American asylum seekers seeking entry into the United States. After being appointed last week by President Joe Biden to work with Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras to address the arrivals at the southern border of the U.S., Harris praised Guatemalan President Alejandro Giammattei's efforts to secure Guatemala's southern border. According to a White House statement, during the call, Harris and Giammattei discussed the risk of journeys to the United States during a global pandemic and agreed to work together to expand opportunity for people in their home countries. In the United States, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo signed a bill this Wednesday allowing recreational use of marijuana by adults aged 21 and over after the state Senate and Assembly voted to approve the legislation. New York became the 5th state in the country to legalize recreational marijuana. Residents will now be able to legally purchase cannabis products from dispensaries licensed by the state or to grow a small number of plants in their own homes. The bill also automatically expunged the criminal records of people previously convicted of crimes that will be legal under the new state. State Senator Liz Krueger, the bill's sponsor in the Senate, spoke passionately about the racial inequalities of drug enforcement and the injustice of marijuana prohibition for young people whose lives were being destroyed for petty offenses that could lead to harsh prison sentences. Several thousand protesters took to the streets of Brazil's biggest cities this Wednesday to mark the 57th anniversary of the coup that established more than 2 decades of military dictatorship. A group rallied in the city of Rio de Janeiro in front of what was a detention center for political repression during the dictatorship to remember the victims of the regime installed following the 1964 coup. Meanwhile, in other parts of the country, political, social and student movements promoted peaceful street mobilizations and also warned that the far-right government of President Jair Bolsonaro was intended to celebrate the date, sparking further fears over the increasing presence of military personnel in top posts of the current administration. In 2019, Bolsonaro sparked outrage after he ordered the military to appropriately commemorate the date, which he does not consider a coup. And there were clashes reported in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro between government supporters and those commemorated the victims of the military dictatorship installed following the coup 57 years ago. Supporters of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro rallied in front of Copacabana Beach before clashing with those who had mobilized to reject the militarization of the Brazilian government. A group of lawmakers representing opposition parties in Brazil's Chamber of Deputies and Senate announced that they will file a new impeachment request against President Jair Bolsonaro. The legislators argued that the president is trying to misappropriate the military forces in Brazil with an evident threat to democracy. On Tuesday, Bolsonaro decided to make command changes in the Army, Air Force and Navy after the officers in charge of these bodies resigned following the resignation of the Minister of Defense, Fernando Azevedo. The high-ranking military officer left the government after disagreements with Bolsonaro over the use of the armed forces for political purposes. The request joins other petitions of a similar nature, accusing the president of acting against the free exercise of political, individual and social rights. Cuban and Russian officials began talks Wednesday in Havana on Wednesday, aimed at strengthening bilateral collaboration in various fields. Cuban Deputy Prime Minister Ricardo Cabrizas and his Russian counterpart Yuri Borisov led their respective delegations in exploring areas of interest to both countries. Delegates discussed issues related to the financial, energy, transport, agriculture, communications and the health sectors. The Russian Deputy Prime Minister's visit to Cuba is part of the 18th session of the Cuba-Russia Intergovernmental Commission for Economic, Commercial and Scientific Technical Collaboration and is expected to last until Thursday. The Russian official arrived in Cuba from Venezuela after a meeting of the Russia-Venezuela High-Level Intergovernmental Commission in Caracas on Tuesday. And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Mali launched its first immunization campaign against COVID-19 with the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine on Wednesday in the city of Bamako. The day took place at the University Hospital Center in the capital, where the Minister of Health, Fanta Sibi, became the first person in the country to receive the dose. Later, the vaccine was applied to health personnel who fight in the front line against the coronavirus. At the beginning of March, Mali became the first country in West Africa, the Sahel, to receive more than 390,000 against COVID-19 vaccines through the COVAX mechanism. A devastating surge in COVID-19 fatalities in Hungary showed no sign of abating Wednesday, as the daily total set a new record of 302 fatalities. The Central European country is in its fourth week of a new round of lockdown measures aimed at mitigating record-breaking infections, hospitalizations and deaths. This is despite an ambitious vaccination program that has given Hungary the highest vaccination rate in the European Union. The number of inoculations rose over 2 million on Tuesday, more than 20% of the population, and the Foreign Minister Peter Sriharto announced Wednesday that 250,000 doses of Russia's Sputnik V vaccine had arrived overnight in the capital, Budapest. French President Emmanuel Macron announced Wednesday that schools will close next week, and a limited lockdown in place in Paris and other regions will be extended to the whole country in a bid to curb soaring COVID-19 cases. In an address to the nation, Macron said that the current efforts to limit the virus were too limited at the time when the epidemic is accelerating. He announced that schools and daycare centers will close for the next 3 weeks, but this will include 2 weeks of spring holiday. He noted this was not a full lockdown, but that the population had to limit its contacts. He also justified his policy of keeping schools open since the end of the first lockdown in spring 2020, which has received intensifying criticism over recent weeks. Travel between different French regions will be banned for the duration of the nationwide light lockdown, while the 7 p.m. curfew currently imposed on 19 regions will be extended to all of mainland France.
Les rencontres, les moments de proximité avec d'autres personnes.
Brazil's new health minister Marcelo Queiroga has called on the population to avoid gatherings over the Easter holiday period, asking people to be responsible and reminding them of the essential use of masks. The minister's comments came as Brazil, which registered a monthly record of over 66,500 COVID-19 related fatalities in March.
The commitment of the Ministry of Health is to be based on solid scientific practices, which can bring improvements in the results we are obtaining so far in terms of mortality. The measures are aimed at reducing mortality, mainly aiming at reducing the number of cases that put pressure on the health system. We know that on major public holidays, the possibility of unnecessary gatherings, people should use masks. The use of masks is essential. People must keep the distance between themselves to avoid transmission of the virus.
In Argentina, authorities estimated that COVID-19 cases have increased by more than 30%, aside with the previous week, with about 1 million people currently infected. Meanwhile, during the vaccination campaign in Mar del Plata, Casilda Ramona Venegas, age 113, became the oldest person in Argentina to receive a COVID-19 vaccine.
I'm very moved because I know that this vaccine will save my life. Finally, now I will be able to visit my grandchildren and kiss my daughters.
Authorities of the Bolivian department of Santa Cruz announced the closure of the border with Brazil for at least 7 days to prevent further spread of the coronavirus. The measure was announced by the Departmental Health Service in coordination with the national authorities. The move takes place in the midst of an increase in cases of the Brazilian variant of the coronavirus in the country. Regional authorities pointed out that the conditions for the border closure and the day on which it will begin have yet to be defined. According to official figures, over 96,000 cases of COVID-19 have been reported in Santa Cruz. Although for most of Colombia, the COVID-19 vaccination campaign is currently limited to senior citizens and health workers, it has been rolled out for people of all ages in certain remote communities. Members of the Santa Sofia indigenous community in the Colombian Amazon have received their first doses of the coronavirus COVID-19 vaccine. The move comes after criticism of the Colombian government for failing to protect and support these vulnerable communities in the midst of the pandemic.
Because we have the chance for the vaccine against this disease that's attacking the world to arrive in our community.
It was a very big surprise for me that the health workers with the vaccine came here to the community. It's really nice, lovely, because for us it's really important to have these vaccines against COVID-19.
Stage 3 clinical trials of Cuba's 5 COVID-19 vaccine candidates are advancing, with authorization for their emergency use expected in May. According to authorities, the shots are expected to be much cheaper than those currently available on the international market and easier to store without requiring low temperatures. If the vaccines prove to be effective, Cuba will become the smallest country in the world and the first in South America to develop multiple vaccines against the novel coronavirus, despite the huge obstacles it faces in acquiring supplies and equipment due to the criminal United States blockade. In this sense, Cuban authorities explained that at the beginning of April, an intervention study will begin in the province of Santi Spiritus with the Abdallah vaccine candidate, in which health sector workers will participate, including personnel from the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology. A similar process will be carried out with the Soberana O2 candidate, where employees from the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries group will participate as volunteers. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. More news now. Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa receives a visit from President of Botswana, Mokgweetsi Masisi, in his capacity as chairperson of the Southern African Development Community Organ on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation. The pair discussed the worsening security situation in northern Mozambique, where dozens of people were recently killed in coordinated terrorist attacks in the town of Palma on Sunday, 4 days after the raid was launched and forced the evacuation of thousands of survivors to safety in the provincial capital, Pemba. The militant attacks was the closest yet to a multi-billion-dollar gas project being built by France's Total and other energy companies.
President Masisi is the current chairperson of the Troika. So he was briefing me about the security situation in the region, with particular emphasis on what is happening in Cabo Delgado.
And we have formed views as a Troika. One of them will result in taking this further so that we as SADC respond in a helpful manner to ensure that we assure the integrity and sovereignty of one of our own, never to be assaulted by dissident, rebellious and non-state actor forces.
In a virtual press conference on Wednesday, the spokesperson for the UN Secretary General stated that UN workers in Mozambique have reported that the security situation remains volatile and is of concern.
To Mozambique, our humanitarian colleagues there tell us that the escalation of violence in Cabo Delgado province continues to drive massive displacement following the recent attacks by non-state armed groups and ongoing clashes reported in Palma since March 24th. The security situation remains volatile and is of concern to all of us. The UN Migration Agency has already registered about 8,000 people at arrival points in Nangade, Moeda, and Winterpuis, as well as Pemba. Thousands have arrived today in Pemba and other areas of Cabo Delgado.
The UN envoy on Myanmar implored the Security Council to take action on Wednesday in the Asian nation's escalating crisis, warning of the risk of civil war and an imminent bloodbath as the junta violently represses pro-democracy protesters. More than 520 people have died in daily demonstrations since the military overthrew elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi on February the 1st, halting Myanmar's decade-old experiment in democracy.
And it is very worrying. It is not only abhorrent in terms of the killings, including of children, which I mentioned, but also the arbitrary detentions, the violations of human rights, and the pressure at the borders, the increased violence, all of those things. I think I can say the Council was united in its condemnation of what is going on. The Secretary-General has underlined the need for a unified, resolute and firm international response, and the Council should play its part. We'll continue to closely monitor the situation and work with our colleagues in the Council and regional partners to help end this senseless violence, hold those responsible to account and secure a path back to democracy.
And the Rwandan High Court Special Chamber for International and Cross-Border Crimes accused businessman Paul Rusesabagina of financing armed groups while leading the Rwandan movement for democratic change. The Office of the Prosecutor of Rwanda proclaimed at least 9 charges against the politician, among which he highlighted the formation of an irregular armed group belonging to a terrorist group, financing terrorism and acts of terrorism such as murder, kidnapping, among others. According to the prosecution, the defendant admitted to having paid at least $20,000 to the Rwandan National Liberation Forces to bring to fit terrorist acts in Eastern Congo. The 5th Brussels Conference was convened by the United Nations and the European Union on March 29th and 30th to secure humanitarian donations for Syria. However, this platform has been denounced by several international political actors as a mechanism to attack and discredit the Syrian government and politicize humanitarian work in the country at the service of certain powers and in the midst of false sanctions. Our correspondent Hicham Wanos brings us the details in the following report.
The 50 countries and 70 entities that participated in the Brussels conference, promoted by the UN and the European Union, do not seek to guarantee humanitarian efforts, but rather to exploit the situation in Syria to achieve political objectives. Syrian authorities condemned the event, stressing that the states that call to mobilize funds in support of those affected by the war are the very same that prevent an end to the crisis and suffocate the Syrian people with their blockade, sanctions and coercive measures.
The recently held so-called Brussels conference is a mere useless propaganda event in the absence of the Syrian state and a platform to attack Syria and try to offend it, as the focus of humanitarian action in Syria should be Damascus and not other cities in neighboring countries or beyond. And this means respecting the principle of sovereignty, unity and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic.
On the eve of the Brussels conference, the heads of the Humanitarian, Refugee and Development Agency of the United Nations organizations, as well as the United States Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, urged to authorize the opening of more border crossings, supposedly to provide cross-border humanitarian aid to Syria, a mechanism that Damascus denounces as in addition to violating the sovereignty of the country. It constitutes a route for the supply of weapons and logistical material to the terrorist groups operating in Syrian soil.
Any operation for the introduction of humanitarian aid in Syria must be conducted in coordination with the Syrian government and under its supervision, since Syria has maritime ports in the Mediterranean that can be used to deliver the aid, while the Syrian state, together with the international organizations, take charge of distributing it to all areas. As such, doubts are raised by the call from the UN and the United States to open illegal borders crossing.
Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation in Syria is getting worse. Instead of donor conferences and those calling to activate the cross-border aid mechanism, Syrians stress that in order to change this reality, the Western economic blockade must be lifted. The United States must stop its looting of the country's energy resources, and foreign support for terrorists must cease. Likewise, obstacles to the return of refugees must be lifted, and support is required for the reconstruction of the country and diplomatic dialogue aimed at reaching a sovereign solution to the conflict.
Hicham Wanos, TeleSUR, Damascus, Syria.
And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.